Hello and welcome back. In the previous video you've created a new service account with client access to DialogFlow. You've downloaded safely. In this video we'll use the DialogFlow Node.js client module and we'll finish setting up authentication. Okay, let's look at the documentation. Look under using the client. Here you see that for authentication you need the project ID, session ID and language code. Let's put them in some config file so that we don't have all this information lying around in the code. All the config stuff should go into separate config file. We'll talk later on more about configuration and safety. Don't worry, I got you covered. For now, let's create a folder called config. New folder, name it config, and inside create a file called keys. New file, keys.js, like this. In here we'll store all configuration keys that we'll need. You're now wondering, what is with the JSON file we created in the previous video? Don't worry, we'll get to it. Now in the keys file we'll add module.exports, like with every file in Node.js. And it will export an object with configuration properties. The first one will be Google Project ID. You can find your project ID in the DialogFlow settings. Here. Copy it and put it in the keys file. Next one is session ID. I'll name the property DialogFlow session ID. This is a string we can make up. I'll call it react-bot-session. You can make up your own. And last that we need is language code. I'll add a property DialogFlow session language code. And it will be in -us. Okay, we have our configuration file set. Good. Now we can use it when configuring client. Go to roots. First we'll import the module const DialogFlow equals require and pass in the name of the module DialogFlow. Like this. Next thing we'll import is the config file we've just created. Const config equals require. Now we need to pass the path to the config keys, so /config/keys. Okay, now we have the config imported. Now we can initialize session client. This is how we do it. Const session client equals new DialogFlow dot sessions client. And then we need to create the session path. So const session path equals session client dot session path. And we'll pass in the project ID. We'll get it from the config file. So config dot Google Project ID. The second parameter is session ID. It's also in the config file. So config dot DialogFlow session ID. Now here we have it. Const session path equals session client session path config Google Project ID and config DialogFlow session ID. Like this. Now go to documentation. Here. We have created this part. The next one is request. Therefore, copy this part. Go back to code and paste it. What we need to change is this language code variable. We need to read it from config file. It will now be config.dialogflow session language code. Okay, great. And this text here will be the text coming from parameter. Therefore, it needs to be rec.body.text. Like this. Now the last part, the detect intent endpoint call. If we look at the documentation, we can see that this code is returning a promise. If you've not yet heard of promises, let me give you a short explanation. For example, a request to some API endpoint is an asynchronous operation, or if you set a timer, you would have code running asynchronous, meaning other code begins to run before the first one has finished. Like API did not give a response back, but the code after the call is already executing. In this type of operation, we use promises. Here we have the then chain code. This means that whatever is in the then part will run after the request returns a response. But the code that is after then will execute before the response is returned. And the code will run asynchronous. And this waiting for the code to get executed after the response is returned is called a promise. Every promise can get resolved or rejected. So if response is returned OK, then the code is resolved. That is this part here. And if there is an error connecting or error authenticating, then the promise is rejected. That is this catch here. Yes? Does that sound logical? Okay. By the way, in the next video, we'll optimize this code a little more. Let me show you something first. Now we'll run the code. Therefore, go to Terminal, to Project Folder, and type npm run backend. This will start our nodemon, okay? And here we have it. Error, unexpected error while acquiring application default credentials. Could not load the default credentials. Browse to application default credentials for more information. You can stop by typing Command or Ctrl+C. Let me open this page that is suggested in the log. I already have it open because I knew this is going to happen. While if you scroll down this page, it will not give you the answer you needed. It took me quite some time to find the answer. And the answer is that we need to load a JSON file to environment variable called Google Application Credentials before we run the application. Let me show you what needs to be done. Okay, what we need to do is set an environment variable Google_application_credentials, and we need to write in the absolute path to JSON keys file we downloaded before. Okay, I will let you write this down and enter the right path and the right name of JSON file. Pause the video and set it up. Okay, I'm back. And I'm in my terminal, and this is my command for setting the variable. Here I have my path. I have a file in this keys directory, and I'll hit enter. You add your path and file name, okay? Once you have it, you can again run the nodemon server by typing npm run backend. Enter. And woohoo, we have no warning, so authentication is now set. Okay, a warning though. Every time you restart your computer, you'll need to run this command in the terminal. You'll need to set up the environment variable, okay? Do not forget this. So if you see authentication error again, it's because the environment variable is not set. Just set it again, okay? Before we test it out, let me show you how to optimize this code a little bit more. Follow me to the next video where we'll talk about async await. See you soon. Bye bye.